Hi guys, if all goes well, tomorrow should be your last recorded day, and then I'll be back in person on Thursday. I know we've been skipping some things here and there in your book. We are behind still, and me being sick has not helped whatsoever. So we are on page 183. Looking at the Missouri Compromise. We're just going to look at a couple more highlights and then move on to Jackson. Missouri Compromise, very important for American history and also for Maine history, as you see highlighted here. So, as we have more and more people moving out west into the newly acquired Louisiana Purchase in yellow there, these territories asked to become states. And Missouri asked to become a state that allowed slavery. They asked to be a slave state. The problem is we have an equal number of free and slave states, and if we allow a slave state in, that would give the slave states extra votes in Congress, and then they might be able to make slavery permanent in America. The free states want to abolish it. Definitely alter the balance of power in the Senate. There are more people in the North than in the South, which means in the House of Representatives, there are more anti-slavers than pro-slavers. There was a guy named Mr. Talmadge, he was a congressman, who suggested that Missouri entered as a free state, and it almost passed, but it did get voted down. Missouri wants to be a slave state. So they passed the Missouri Compromise. They said Missouri may be a slave state if Maine becomes a free state. Maine had been wanting to become a state for a few years at this point. So they said, great, this will help the balance of power for now. What about all the rest of this territory in yellow that will become states one day? What are we going to do with all that? And so the Missouri Compromise not only brought in Missouri and Maine, but also made rules for new states. And they drew a line right here called the 3630 line. That is the parallel on the globe. They're 36 degrees, 30 minutes north of the equator. They said all states that come into the Union north of that line must be free. All states below would be slave. Now, if you notice, all the blue here is still owned by Spain at the time, so we don't own anything in blue. We just own all this yellow. Does that seem like a fair compromise between free and slave? Not at all. It's giving way more land and more states to free states. This Missouri Compromise will end slavery in all of America. As soon as enough people move out here to create more free states, they will be able to get rid of slavery if we obey the Missouri Compromise. Sad fact is that several more slave states come in north of the Missouri Compromise. We basically just throw out that whole thing and have a civil war instead of voting slavery out. This was called the knell of the Union. Thomas Jefferson says, this momentous question, the question of slavery, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror. I considered it at once the knell of the Union. The knell is the funeral bell that you ring, the church bell at a funeral. It's a death knell. Jefferson says if we cannot agree on slavery, the Union will be destroyed. There will be no more America. John Quincy Adams, the president, he wrote, I take it for granted that the present question is a mere preamble, a title page for a great tragic volume. So John Quincy Adams and Thomas Jefferson both say, I doubt that this compromise is going to work. We're not going to fix slavery except by a civil war, which is exactly what happened. Thankfully, it does push war off for another, 50 years or so? What date was the Missouri Compromise finally enacted? 1819? Oh, not even 50 years, like 35 years. There you go. The North is gaining a lot more population than the South very quickly. A lot of immigrants are moving into the North to get jobs up there, not in the South. So abolitionism is on the rise and slavery is on the decline. They're not going to go without a fight, though. It's only a matter of time till we have more free states and slave states, and then there will be a fight. So we come to the election of 1824. There are no Federalists, and there are 4 Democratic Republicans. So that's weird. There's only one party, but there's 4 different factions inside the party. Those 4 people are Crawford, John Quincy Adams, Clay, and Andrew Jackson. You might recognize the name John Q. Adams. He is John Adams's son, so the second president's son. And then Andrew Jackson. Henry Clay is important, but probably not until we get to a little higher level history. Um, Nobody got a majority. No one got over 51% of the vote. Andrew Jackson gets what's called a plurality. That means he got more votes than anyone else, but still not 51%. And according to our Constitution, you do not win the presidency if you don't get more than 51%, even if you have more than everyone else. So the Constitution says if no one gets over 50%, the House of Representatives gets to vote on who becomes the next president. That's only happened a couple times in our history, literally twice in our history that's ever happened, that no one's got over half the votes. Clay, by the way, the House gets a vote for the top three. So number 4 was Clay. He did not get enough votes to be in the top 3, so he's not considered. So he persuades Congress, hey, if you were going to vote for me, why don't you vote for John Adams instead? So he kind of like gives his votes to John Adams. And John Adams was second, but now John Adams plus Clay gets in first place, and John Quincy Adams wins. Of course, Jackson is furious, especially once he finds out that Adams then hired Clay to be Secretary of State. Secretary of State is probably the second most important position in government. It goes President, Secretary of State. Very, very important position. And Jackson thinks that Clay kind of sold his votes for a good job. And he calls that the corrupt bargain. So Jackson is just stinking furious. So it's not fair. I got more votes than Adams. Clay sold his votes for a good job. It's not fair. I ought to be president. He says, in 4 years, I'm coming back. I'm going to stomp you, and I'm going to be president in 4 years, which he does. John Quincy Adams was already a political expert by the time he ran for president. He had been Secretary of State, very important job. He had been the one who bought Florida from the Spaniards as Secretary of State. That's probably the most important thing he did. He was highly educated. He knew all the classics, Greek and Latin and all that. He worked for his dad from a very young age. When John Adams was overseas talking to politicians in France and England and Spain and Germany, John Quincy Adams, at like age 11 or 12, would be in all those meetings taking notes for his dad. So he was way more qualified than most of the other people running for office. He had already traveled all of Europe by the time he was a teenager, for goodness sake. He was very knowledgeable. He was very nationalist and isolationist, which means, build stuff in America and ignore outsiders. And that made his group of Democratic Republicans different from other Democratic Republicans. And so they renamed his particular faction the National Republicans. They want to build roads and bridges and canals and that kind of thing in America. Jackson says, I'm not going to be Republican. I'm not going to be Democratic Republican. I'm just going to be Democratic. And that really does kind of invent the modern day Democratic Party, although Jackson was very different from modern Democrats. As president, when John Q. Adams was president in New England, we are going on this factory boom where people are building factories right, left, and center. And for the very first time, factory jobs were more plentiful than shipbuilding jobs in New England. The shipbuilding was still and is still today a very important job in New England, but factory jobs surpassed that. Remember the tariff? A tariff is when you charge people money for importing goods to America. So like English people selling stuff in America have to pay an extra tax. That helps Americans to buy American, because an American made thing might be cheaper than an English thing because the English have to pay extra taxes that the Americans don't. So New Englanders want a very high tariff to make people buy New England made stuff, buy stuff made in America rather than made overseas. In the South, people aren't interested as much in nationalism and what's making America powerful. They're interested in what's called sectionalism, what's good for my section of the country. And in the South, they are very heavily dependent on trade, and they hate the tariff. They do not want the tariff. They want a very low tariff. So the North and South are angry about slavery. They're also angry about the tariff. And that leads us to chapter 10, Page 186 and 187. We're going to be flying through the first section or two here today. Jacksonian America. The dreaded tariff was raised by another quite a bit, all the way up to 50%. So if you sell an item for $100, you then also have to pay a tax of $50, which means that the new price of the item is $150. So if an English person makes a chair and sells it in America, it's going to cost 50% more than the chair already made in America. No one's going to be buying foreign made stuff then. It's just too expensive. People are all going to be buying stuff made in America. Great for New England, stinks for the South. And here's a comic written in the South, funeral somethings of free trade. It's a funeral where the trade is dead because the tariff killed it. The South called this tariff the tariff of abominations. They're really mad at it. And they say, how can the government write a law that's good for the North and bad for the South? It's favoring one section of America over the other, and that's not fair. I will say every law helps some people more than other people. That's just how politics works. All laws are going to benefit some people more than others. But yeah, this is probably too far. Raising the tariff all the way up to 50% is great for the North, terrible for the South, and I'm not sure that this was a great idea. Besides, another big problem is the money being made off the tariff is going to the North. So not only are you taking extra money from the South, but you're also spending it in the North, and the South especially did not like that at all. And I understand why they did not like that. That was not a very kind move. In Charleston, South Carolina, when they heard that this tariff was passed, they brought all the flags down to half-mast as a day of mourning. The South Carolina legislature declares that the tariff of abominations is unconstitutional. And remember, they're not allowed to do that. The Supreme Court is the one who does that. The states aren't allowed to do that. You have to obey the law, even if you don't like it. They threaten to nullify the tariff. Vice President Calhoun is actually from South Carolina, and he's giving speeches about how awful the tariff is. And eventually he's going to resign his vice presidency because he can't get the president, John Quincy Adams, to undo the tariff. So lots of anger, lots of drama there. 4 years later, 1828, there is a new presidential election, and this time it's just John Quincy Adams versus Andrew Jackson. It's a rematch, and Jackson has spent 4 years thinking up ways to defeat John Quincy Adams, and he does. Many people who had voted for Crawford and Clay in the previous election are now going to vote for Jackson, so he's going to get a pretty big majority. And here you can see the map. Jackson chose Vice President Calhoun to be his running mate. So Adams's vice president is now Andrew Jackson's vice president. That is that's surprising. I mean, imagine if Joe Biden ran with Mike Pence as his running mate. That would be weird, but I guess you're allowed to do that if you want. And they win by a landslide. Look at all these states voting for Jackson and only a handful of states voting for John Quincy Adams. This is an interesting thing. For the very first time, over 1 million people voted. And that was double the amount of people who voted in the last election. Apparently in 1824, there were a bunch of people who could have voted who just didn't feel like voting. And this time, voter participation doubled. It's pretty common in modern America to have only about 2/3 of the people who could vote actually bother voting. And I would highly recommend once you turn 18, vote as often as you can in every election you can. It is a privilege. It's also a responsibility. Who was Andrew Jackson? He was born to a very poor family, an immigrant family. His dad died, and he was raised by a single mother. So that makes being in a poor family even more difficult. Being raised by a single mom, he had a very rough life. Grew up barefoot a lot of the time because his mom couldn't afford shoes for him. When he was just 13 years old, he joined the army to fight in the American Revolution. So, okay, just 13-year-old soldier there. He became, after the war, a lawyer, a judge, and a congressman, and of course, a famous soldier in the War of 1812. He was very famous for violence. He was a very angry person. His brother died in a British prison. He blamed the British for that. Um, just a very angry person. He fought the Battle of Horseshoe Bend against the Native Americans down in the South and slaughtered many of them. Battle of New Orleans, famous for that. He invaded Florida before we owned it. Lots of shenanigans down there. He had fought a lot of duels. There was one time he was in a duel and the guy shoots him and he shoots the other guy, and the bullet hits Andrew Jackson like an inch away from his heart, and it lodges there, and he has a bullet right next to his heart for the rest of his life. There was one time in the White House after he was president, someone says something about his wife that he didn't like, so he drug him in the backyard and shot him. There is a picture in your book on page 189 of Andrew Jackson stabbing a guy. Apparently, Jackson picked a fight with him, and then when he leaned down to grab a rock, he stabbed him in the back. And then he became president. So, just famous for violence, killed lots of people in his life, both in war and not in war, just murder. Oy. He wanted to be the people's president. He's not a snooty rich kid like John Quincy Adams was a rich kid. He was born to a very rich family and was in politics and in the White House most of his life. So he's the people's president. He invited all Americans to visit the White House after the election to celebrate. And what started out as a party turned into a mob as people were jumping up and down on the couches. They were ripping off wallpaper as souvenirs. They were taking these fancy chairs and smashing them on the ground so they could take a chair leg back home and say, hey, I got a chair leg from the White House. They're tracking mud all over beautiful carpets. Windows get smashed accidentally as people are pushing and shoving. They had like this food, and the food is getting just spilled all over the floors and squished into the carpet, and it is just an absolute mess. Jackson changed the way government jobs are filled. He started what's called the spoil system. Talks about the spoil system on page 190, and there's lots of extra interesting tidbits that you could look at on your own time. But on page 190, the spoil system. This comes from the phrase "to the victor go the spoils." When you win a battle, you get to take all the stuff that your enemy owned, and that's how he filled government jobs. Government jobs used to go to the people who are most qualified. Andrew Jackson said, if you help me win the presidency, I will give you a job. So sometimes there are people who had no idea what they were doing, but they were given a fancy position because they passed out flyers or gave a speech. Hey, everyone, elect Andrew Jackson. So probably not the best way to pick your politicians. Jackson used cabinet positions as a reward. So your cabinet positions are your Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of War, Secretary of the Interior, of Agriculture, all those really important jobs. And he handed out these jobs to people he liked, not to people who knew what they were doing. So unfortunately, they weren't very useful. Instead, he got a group of advisors who did know what they were doing in all these different areas that he listened to, but who didn't actually have jobs. And they were called his kitchen cabinet because they're the fake cabinet, I guess. I don't know. Under Andrew Jackson, they lowered the tariff just a little bit, but it's still considered too high. So South Carolina nullified it. They said, we just won't pay that tax. We're going to ignore that law. And they threatened secession. We will remove ourselves from the country and we'll be our own country because we don't want to pay your tariffs. Andrew Jackson got really mad and said, I will send an army down there and force you to pay that tariff. He actually did send a battleship along with the tax collector ship and said, you will pay that tariff or I'm going to get you. Calhoun is so mad about the tariff that he resigns as vice president to become senator from South Carolina. And they get in a shouting match, and Jackson threatens to kill him. And what's new? Jackson threatened to hang Calhoun, passes the force bill, said he would march an army down there to reduce that state to obedience. I'm going to shoot everyone in the country if you don't obey me, which is it's very Jacksonian. When you don't get your way, just threaten to shoot people. And what's really important here, though, is just making sure that everyone knows states are not allowed to ignore federal laws. They may not nullify federal laws. Only the Supreme Court can call a law unconstitutional. A state's not allowed to do that. And then if you try to disunionize yourself, you try to get out of the country. If South Carolina says, I don't want to be part of America anymore, that is considered treason many years before the Civil War. Clay got the title of the Great Compromiser for being able to pass an even further reduced tariff that's a little bit nicer to both sides. South Carolina says, okay, we apologize, we won't nullify it after all, and war is delayed. Once again, we do not have a civil war for another 25 years now. This is super, super sad. And we're going to end talking about the way Andrew Jackson treated Native Americans. The Seminoles in Florida were led by a guy named Osceola. And when America bought Florida, we said, we don't want any Seminoles here. You have to leave. A lot of them said, we don't want to leave. So they stayed in the swamps and they fought guerrilla warfare. Andrew Jackson put a price on their heads. He said, if you bring me or bring the government a Seminole scalp, we will pay you. So we were hiring people to murder Native Americans because we wanted to steal their land. So not a highlight of American history. In that fighting, we did send down the army, and about 1,500 Americans died, and many, many thousands of Seminoles were killed, and more were sent way out west. Furthering Andrew Jackson's terrible treatment of Native Americans were the Cherokees. The Cherokees were one of the 5 civilized tribes. We call them civilized because they adopted a lot of American habits and lifestyles. So they wore, as you can see here, American-style clothing. Even this turban, you might think it looks weird, but there's a picture of Thomas Jefferson wearing a turban kind of like that. So that was kind of normal. He's wearing American clothes. This guy, his name is Sequoia. He invented a written language for the Cherokee. They did not have a written language. We invented one. It's called a syllabary because it works on syllables, not on just individual sounds, which is interesting. But they gave up their hunting lifestyle and made European-style farms. They built roads. They had schools. They learned English. They're basically integrating into American society. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Creek. Who am I missing? I think they're even listed in your book, the 5. I don't know. But the Cherokee are really who we're focusing on today. So basically, there is no difference between them and their American neighbors. They are very, very American. They had their own newspapers. They published the Bible in their own language. They have their own pastors. They have everything that we would consider civilized. There's a Cherokee newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix in the Cherokee language. Pretty cool. So these are not savages. They're not wild men. They're just your neighbors. There's a Cherokee Bible. We had a peace treaty with them. We treated them like a foreign nation, like any European would treat its neighbors. We had ambassadors in the Cherokee lands. They sent an ambassador to Washington, D.C. We were completely at peace. There were no problems whatsoever. It was nice and peaceful. By the way, they live in Georgia. And everything went swimmingly until we found gold on Cherokee land. So thousands of Americans rush into Cherokee farmland. The word here is squat. That means illegally living on land that's not yours, stealing land. Americans rush towards Cherokee land, digging for gold, and they start stealing all the Cherokees' gold that they found there. The Cherokee ambassadors complained to Congress saying, hey, your people are stealing all our stuff. So Congress said, you're right, the peace treaty says if any Americans are troubling you, we got to deal with them. So Congress passes a law that says Americans get out of there. Americans are illegally immigrating to a different nation. When we think of illegal immigration, we think of Americans as the victims here. But in this case, Americans are the ones who are illegally crossing borders to steal their neighbor's gold. And so Congress says, no, you have to get out of there. The Americans don't leave. even after this law. So the Cherokee sue and say, hey, Supreme Court, you got to make the people obey the law now. So John Marshall, who's the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said, you're absolutely right. The law says you're not allowed to steal your neighbor's land. And all their gold. So the Supreme Court said, Andrew Jackson, by the way, that's John Marshall, head of the Supreme Court. They said, Andrew Jackson, send soldiers down to protect the border to make sure that Americans do not steal Cherokee land and defend our neighbors from illegal American immigrants. Jackson said, no, I'm going to go send troops to attack Cherokees, kill them, and push them off their land and steal their land so Americans could have all the Cherokee land. So Congress says, protect the Cherokees. Supreme Court says, protect the Cherokees. Andrew Jackson says, no, I'm going to steal all their land and kill or push them away. That's so wrong on so many levels. This is called the Trail of Tears and Death because soldiers came to Cherokee villages and they knocked on the doors, and sometimes they gave them a day or two warning. Tomorrow we're going to walk from Georgia to Oklahoma, and that's where you're going to be. And so they're given very little time to prepare. Here's a famous painting of that. Many people did not have enough food or clothing or supplies or anything. How can you prepare for a cross-country walk in a day or two? Somewhere around 2,000 to 6,000 Cherokee died out of about 16,000 total Cherokee. Andrew Jackson used the American Army to murder about a third of our friends, the Cherokee, because we wanted their gold. This is one of the worst things America has ever done. This is absolutely dreadful. No reason other than we wanted their money. Today we would call that genocide when you're murdering so many people of a people group just because they're Cherokee. We're not killing them because they're criminals. We're killing them because they're Cherokee. We would call that a war crime today. But Andrew Jackson is now on our $20 bill. Why is Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill? He's not a good person. Here's some of the routes that were taken. It's not a single trail, and it didn't happen in a single day. There were many different villages that were kicked out on different times. So you see here, the Cherokees are sent up here. We have the Creek, Chickasaw, and the Choctaw. Some of them are sent down to Louisiana before coming up here. A lot of Seminoles from Florida are being shipped up through the Mississippi. They're all being sent out to what is now Oklahoma. Very, very sad. This man is George W. Harkins. He is a Cherokee. He says, it is with considerable diffidence that I attempt to address the American people, knowing and feeling sensibly my incompetency. That is, he's saying, I'm kind of shy. Diffidence means shyness. I'm shy to talk to the American people, knowing that I'm not very clever, is what he's saying. So please listen to me, even though I'm not very clever. I would say a lot more competent than a lot of people today. He said, and believing that your highly and well-improved minds would not be well entertained by the address of a Choctaw. Oh, he's not Cherokee, he's Choctaw. Saying, you white people are so smart, you probably think I'm really dumb, but please listen to me anyway. But having determined to emigrate west of the Mississippi River this fall, so he's going to leave before the soldiers come get him. He's just going to go on his own. I have thought proper in bidding you farewell to make a few remarks expressive of my views and the feelings that actuate me on the subject of our removal. So I want to tell you how I feel about being kicked out of my country. We as Choctaws rather chose to suffer and be free than live under the degrading influence of laws which our voice cannot be heard in their formation. I would rather leave my country and go live in a desert, leave everything I know, pack up and move, than live in America where I'm not allowed to vote on the laws because I'm not white. America is supposed to be a place of democracy where everyone gets a say in the government. But at this time, that really means only white people have a say in the government. And I don't think anyone could look at this picture and read these words and say, yeah, you're too dumb to vote. You're a savage. You don't get the vote. But that's what they said back then. I'm glad it's not that way today. unfortunately, even after stealing all the Cherokee land and Choctaw land and Chickasaw land, stealing all their gold, taking all their stuff, Americans were still super greedy. And years later, about 50 years later, we decided we want Oklahoma too. So for the second time in their history, we steal all their land and kick them even further west. We break our own treaties, break our laws, break our word, and steal all their land and kick them out. Um, this time, thousands more people die. There's a lot more hardship, and they're put on the worst desert land that we could possibly find. Um, so we couldn't leave it alone. The Trail of Tears and Death wasn't bad enough. We had to actually do it for a second time. Uh, as you can maybe tell, Andrew Jackson, not my favorite president ever.